This case would be called America's oldest cold case ever solved. Except the man convicted of it never touched the victim. Let that sit for a second. A murder conviction, over 50 years old. Juries don't get things like that wrong. Except in this case, there was almost nothing at all. There was one woman's memory of a stranger's face, a face she saw for less than 10 minutes, when she was 8 years old, half a century before she ever pointed to it in a photograph. This is the story of one night in a small town that never locked its doors, a night that ended a little girl's life, and years later, nearly ended an innocent man's too. December 3rd, 1957, Sycamore, Illinois. Population under 7,000. The first snow of the season came down that evening, soft and quiet, the kind kids pressed their faces to windows for. Maria Ridolf was 7 years old, big brown eyes, a laugh you could hear across a yard. She begged her parents to let her go outside and play in the snow with her best friend, Kathy Sigmund, who lived just down the street. It was already dark. Nobody thought twice about it. The girls met on the corner of Center Cross Street and Archie Place. They started their favorite game, hiding behind a big elm tree every time a car's headlights swept the street. A game nobody would ever remember, if not for what happened next. A man walked up out of the dark, young, maybe in his 20s, light hair, a gap in his teeth, a bright, colorful sweater, the kind of thing you'd remember. He smiled at the girls and said his name was Johnny. Neither girl felt afraid, not for 1 second. Johnny asked if they liked piggyback rides. Maria said yes before she'd even really thought about it. This was a stranger, in the dark, talking to two little girls alone on a street corner, and it felt completely, totally normal. That's how safe this town believed itself to be. He gave Maria a piggyback ride around the corner. Nothing about it looked dangerous. Then he told her if she wanted another ride, she should go home and bring back a doll to show him. Maria ran home. She came back holding one. Kathy stayed with Johnny the whole time she was gone. He asked if she wanted to go for a walk, or a car ride, or a bus ride somewhere. She said no. He told her she was pretty. Then her hands got cold, and she ran home for her mittens. She was gone even less time than Maria had been. When she came back to that street corner, nobody was there. No Maria, no Johnny. Just an empty street corner, snow still falling, and a silence that would follow this town for the rest of its life. Kathy called out for her friend. Nothing answered back. She ran to Maria's house and banged on the door. Maria's older brother, Chuck, answered, 11 years old, figuring his sister was just hiding somewhere. He told Kathy to go look again. She did. She called Maria's name into the dark, over and over. Nothing. It took time, too much time, for anyone to understand what was actually happening. Chuck searched the yards himself first. Only when that turned up, nothing did the weight of it finally hit the family. A 7-year-old girl does not vanish off a street corner 2 houses from home. Not in Sycamore. They called the police. And then Sycamore changed forever. Within the hour, this wasn't a family looking for a missing child anymore. It was the whole town. Neighbors poured out of their homes with flashlights. Men grabbed shotguns and rifles they kept for hunting, and started walking the streets in the dark, knocking on doors that had never once needed a knock before. Police set up roadblocks on every road leading out of town. They stopped cars at random and searched trunks one after another, looking for a 7-year-old girl who might still be alive somewhere in the back of one of them. They searched all night. They found nothing. Then, near a neighbor's garage, not far from where the girls had been playing, someone found Maria's doll, just sitting there, discarded, which meant one thing nobody wanted to say out loud. He'd had her. And at some point, close to home, something of hers had been left behind, or thrown away. By morning, this wasn't just a Sycamore problem anymore. Word had spread across the state, then across the country. Within days, federal agents would be involved. A name that meant something even bigger than local police would be attached to this case. One that would eventually reach all the way to the president's desk. Because somewhere out there, in the snow, in the dark, was a stranger who called himself Johnny. And somewhere out there, for now, still alive, still missing, was a 7-year-old girl named Maria. Christmas morning came to the Ridolf house that year, and under the tree sat presents nobody opened. Through that winter, the search for Johnny turned up nothing. Winter passed. Still no answers came. Then, on April 26, 1958, two men out hunting mushrooms in the woods near Woodbine, Illinois, almost 100 miles from Sycamore, found something that stopped them cold. A body. Small. What was left of it had been out there for 5 months. It was Maria. Doctors couldn't even determine how she died. No visible wounds to point to. Just a little girl's remains and a town about to feel its worst fear confirmed. Investigators didn't even take photographs at the scene. The local coroner made that call himself. He didn't want images of her like this ending up in newspapers, in front of people who never knew her. It was meant as mercy, but it meant this case would have to be built almost entirely on memory. Not film, not evidence. And decades later, that decision would change everything. Investigators went back through everyone they'd talked to in Sycamore. One name kept surfacing, a boy who lived just a couple blocks from the Ridolfs, 18 years old. Same build as the man Kathy described, same light hair. Investigators sat down with him and asked him directly where he'd been that night. He said he was 40 miles away, in Rockford, trying to enlist in the Air Force. He said he'd called his family's house from a payphone that evening to ask for a ride home. For the first time since Maria disappeared, police thought they might finally have the right man. Then the alibi checked out. The phone call was real. It had actually happened at almost the exact time Maria disappeared, 40 miles away. He agreed to take a polygraph test. He passed it. And just like that, the only name that had ever really lined up with the description, cleared. Police shook his hand, thanked his family for cooperating, and moved on. The boy joined the military just days later, and Sycamore, for the most part, forgot his name entirely. Meanwhile, Kathy kept trying to help. She was the only person alive who had actually seen Johnny's face. So, over and over, investigators sat her down in front of photographs, grown men, mugshots, strangers, and asked an 8-year-old to point at the one who'd taken her best friend. In December, just weeks after Maria vanished, they took her all the way to a police station in Wisconsin. They showed her a lineup of men. She looked at their faces, and she pointed. She was sure. She told them this was Johnny. His name was Thomas Rivard. A man in his mid-30s, nothing like the young man Kathy had described just weeks earlier. And when police checked his story, they found something that should have ended the case for good, in the worst way possible. He'd been sitting in a jail cell on the night Maria disappeared. He couldn't have been anywhere near that street corner. An 8-year-old girl, trying desperately to do the one thing every adult around her needed her to do, had pointed at an innocent man. Just because memory, especially a child's memory of a face seen once in the dark, is far less reliable than anyone in that room wanted to believe. But the warning passed unnoticed. Months passed, then years. The leads dried up one by one until there weren't any left to follow. On the surface, Sycamore moved on. Kids went back to playing outside. Families still didn't lock their doors mostly, but it didn't move on the same way for everyone. Kathy grew up carrying something most kids never have to carry. She'd been told, again and again, that she was the only one who could ever identify Johnny. So, she looked, in crowds, at bus stops, in strangers walking past her on the street. For years, she couldn't stop herself from searching every unfamiliar face for the one from that snowy night, half expecting every single time that it might finally be him. It never was. The case file sat in a drawer somewhere in a police station, gathering dust year after year. New detectives came and went. Old detectives retired, and some of them died without ever learning who Johnny really was. Sycamore had its story, the one about the little girl and the stranger and the snow, but it didn't have an ending, just a hole where an ending should have been. 50 years is a long time for a wound to stay open. Long enough for almost everyone who remembered that night firsthand to grow old themselves. Long enough for the boy who'd once been cleared, all those decades ago, to live an entire second life somewhere far away from Sycamore. Back in Sycamore, his name had long since faded away. Nobody thought this case would ever move again. Then, one dying woman in a hospital room hundreds of miles from where it all started said 5 words to her daughter. And nothing about this case would ever be the same. Quick pause, drop a comment, and let us know where you're watching from and what time it is right there. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe so you don't miss where this goes next. Now, back to the case. A dying woman grabbed her daughter's wrist. Her grip was stronger than anyone expected from someone that close to the end. 5 words came out first. John did it. John did it. Then more. Those 2 little girls, and the one who disappeared. Her voice cracked, but she pushed through it. You have to tell someone. This was 1994, 37 years after Maria vanished. The woman was Eileen Tessier, mother of the boy who'd been cleared decades earlier, the one with the airtight alibi, the one everyone had long since forgotten. Her daughter Janet sat beside the hospital bed, hearing her own brother accused of murder with her mother's dying breath. Janet didn't know what to do with that. She promised her mother she'd tell someone, but telling someone turned out to be the hardest part. Janet called the police. They told her the case was closed, had been for decades, and there was nothing to investigate. She called the FBI. Same answer. She tried again a few years later. Same answer. Again after that. A woman on her deathbed accusing her own son of murder should have opened doors. Instead, every door Janet knocked on stayed shut. 14 years passed like this. Janet raising the alarm and nobody listening. Then, in 2008, she tried one last time. An email sent to the Illinois State Police, almost as an afterthought after over a decade of being ignored. This time, somebody read it. An investigator picked up the file, blew the dust off a case nobody had touched in decades, and quietly, without fanfare, Sycamore's oldest wound was reopened. What investigators found next was worse than anyone expected. The boy who'd left Sycamore back in 1957, cleared, polygraphed, forgotten, had built a second life in Washington State, one that ended with a police badge. He now went by Jack McCullough, but the badge hid more than it revealed. A 15-year-old runaway named Michelle Weinman had come to him for help. He was a cop, someone she thought she could trust. Instead, he assaulted her. The case collapsed into a minor charge, and he walked away. Then came his own sister. Jean, one of the same sisters who'd grown up in that house with him, told investigators he had abused her when she was a child. Not once, for years. A police officer with a hidden history of preying on the vulnerable. A sister carrying decades-old allegations she'd never told police before. A mother's dying accusation. Suddenly, the boy everyone assumed was innocent looked like a man who'd spent most of his adult life in plain sight. But there was still one enormous problem. The phone call. The alibi. 40 miles away, verified, at almost the exact moment Maria disappeared. That alibi hadn't just cleared him in 1957. It had held up perfectly for decades. So investigators did something that should have raised more alarm than it did. They went back and re-examined exactly when Maria vanished. And they built a new timeline, one that pushed the abduction earlier. Just enough minutes to make the timeline work. It was thin. It depended on shaving away the very margin that had once cleared him. But it was enough to make his guilt possible again. And that's when they turned back to the one person who had actually seen Johnny's face. Kathy was in her 60s now. A grandmother. Decades removed from that street corner, that snowfall, that stranger's voice. In 2010, investigators sat her down one more time and showed her a photograph. She looked at it the way she'd looked at hundreds of photographs before, searching every stranger's face, for the one she could never forget. This time, she said yes. She said it was him. The same face she'd carried in her memory since she was 8 years old, identifying now a photo of a man in his 70s who used to be her neighbor. An eyewitness who'd once pointed at an innocent man in a Wisconsin lineup was now, half a century later, asked to rely on that same recollection all over again. And this time, everyone believed her. In June of 2011, police brought McCullough in for questioning. He denied everything, told investigators, "Look at my eyes," as if innocence were something you could see just by staring hard enough. But when he talked about Maria, something in his voice changed. He didn't sound like a man defending himself against a stranger's death. He sounded almost tender. He called her lovely, said she had beautiful eyes. Then investigators pushed harder, asking him to walk them through his old alibi, the same one that had held for most of his life. And piece by piece, it started to crack. Details he'd once been certain of, he now couldn't remember. Parts of the story that used to line up perfectly no longer matched what he was saying in that room. The man who'd once passed a polygraph without hesitation was now stumbling over his own version of events. By the time that interrogation ended, everything seemed to be pointing in one direction. A mother's last words, a sister's long-buried allegations, a badge that hid a predator, an eyewitness's memory finally trusted, and a man whose own story was falling apart in real time. It felt, for the first time since that snowy December night, like the truth was finally within reach. But truth and certainty are not the same thing, and this case, more than almost any other in American history, was about to prove exactly how far apart those two things can be. 55 years after Maria vanished into the snow, the man accused of taking her finally walked into a courtroom. He was 72 years old, gray hair, glasses, a slow walk. Nothing about him looked like the description of a young man with a gap-toothed smile that had haunted this town for over half a century. And yet, here he was, sitting at the defense table, about to answer for a crime committed when he was still a teenager himself. Prosecutors stood up and told the jury exactly what they believed happened that night. They said McCullough lured Maria away with the promise of another piggyback ride. They said he choked her with a wire, stabbed her in the throat, then drove nearly 100 miles through the dark to leave her body in the woods where she wouldn't be found for 5 months. It was a theory, not a confession, but the evidence they laid out next made it feel almost undeniable. Kathy took the stand and pointed at him. The same identification she'd made 2 years earlier, the same face she said she'd never forgotten. His own sister testified that he owned a sweater matching the description from that night, and that after Maria disappeared, she never saw it again. An old girlfriend produced a train ticket he'd never used. Evidence, prosecutors argued, that he'd had his car with him after all, and time enough to drive. Then came the jailhouse informants, men who'd shared a cell with him at some point, now telling the court he'd confessed to them behind bars. Men who had every reason in the world to want a deal in exchange for that testimony. And finally, the deathbed words. A dying woman's accusation against her own son, spoken to a daughter in a hospital room, was read aloud to the jury as evidence, even though technically, legally, it was nothing more than hearsay. What the jury didn't hear was almost as important. The defense tried introducing the original FBI documents from 1957, records created when memories were fresh and the trail was still warm, the phone logs, the polygraph results. The judge ruled them too old and unreliable to admit, yet memories just as old, working against McCullough, stayed in. The contradiction was hard to ignore. There was one more thing the jury didn't know when this trial began. Just weeks earlier, in a separate trial, prosecutors had already tried to convict McCullough once, accusing him of raping his own sister, Jean, decades earlier. That case fell apart. No physical evidence, memories too old to hold up on their own. He walked free. So by the time the murder trial started, this was already a second attempt. And this time, the state came in with more. On September 14, 2012, the judge delivered his verdict, guilty. The courtroom exploded. After generations of silence, an empty answer where a name should have been, and now, finally, a name. People who had grown old waiting for this moment exhaled. Maria's family believed at last that justice had come, even if it came far later than anyone deserved. McCullough was sentenced to life in prison. 73 years old, no chance of ever walking free again outside those walls. For most of the town, this felt like the end of the story, but not for everyone. Some of McCullough's own family members, the same family who had turned him in, who had carried this suspicion for decades, sat in that courtroom feeling something more complicated than relief. Not outright doubt, just unease. A feeling that something about how quickly this all came together, after so many years of nothing, didn't sit right. A monster had finally been caught. A little girl had finally gotten her name spoken in a guilty verdict. Sycamore believed it finally had closure. Case closed. Man in prison. Life sentence, no parole for 20 years, at an age where 20 years might as well have meant forever. Everyone moved on, everyone except one man, a prosecutor who hadn't even been part of the original trial, who would eventually sit down, years later, and start reading through the exact same files everyone else had already decided didn't matter. He wasn't looking for a reason to doubt the verdict. He found one anyway. A prosecutor sat alone in his office, reading a file nobody had asked him to reopen. He wasn't a defense attorney. He wasn't some outsider looking to score a headline. Richard Schmack worked for the same office that had put McCullough away for life. His job, technically, was to defend that conviction, not tear it apart. But something in the old records bothered him enough to keep reading. He went back to the phone call, the one from 1957, the one everyone had spent years arguing about. Was it 30 minutes before the murder, or an hour after, or somewhere in between? Except Schmack didn't just find a phone booth somewhere in Rockford. He found the exact location, a specific spot, verifiable, on record. The very same place McCullough had described from the very first day investigators ever asked him back in 1957, before anyone had any reason to disbelieve a word he said. Then Schmack did the math nobody else had bothered to finish. The distance between that phone and the street corner where Maria disappeared. The road conditions that December night were icy and dangerous. The actual time it would take a car from that era to cover that ground on icy winter roads. It didn't work, not by a comfortable margin, not even close. There was no honest version of that night where McCullough was in two places at once. Schmack didn't do this quietly out of protectiveness for the accused. He was undoing his own office's biggest win in 55 years, and he did it anyway. In 2016, he filed something almost nobody expected, a formal recommendation that the conviction be thrown out. A judge agreed. In April of 2016, 76-year-old Jack McCullough walked out of prison a free man. Two families had spent years building their entire understanding of this case around his guilt. Now they had to live with a different truth. Some of them couldn't. To this day, parts of Maria's own family still believe the right man was locked up, and the wrong decision let him go. But the state didn't stop at simply releasing him. 1 year later, in April of 2017, a court did something almost unheard of. Not just an overturned conviction, not just a technical release on appeal, a certificate of innocence, officially, legally, permanently. The same justice system that had once called him a murderer now called him innocent. Two opposite verdicts now existed at the same time, guilty, then innocent, both official, neither one erasing the other from history. So if McCullough didn't do it, who did? There was another name in the file, William Henry Redmond, a traveling laborer loosely connected to another child's death years earlier. Investigators looked at him briefly, then let the trail die. He died in 1992. Whatever he knew, whatever he did or didn't do, went into the ground with him. Nobody will ever get the chance to ask him a single question. And there's something else worth holding on to before this story ends. None of this makes McCullough a good man. Whatever happened to Maria Ridolph, he still has a documented history of hurting women and girls across decades of his life. Both of these things are true at the same time, and neither one cancels out the other. He may not be the man who took Maria. That doesn't mean he was ever someone worth trusting. In 2017, not long after his release, an anonymous tip came in, a new name sent to police, about a case everyone thought was finally closed. Police have never explained who sent it. Authorities never revealed the name or whether it led anywhere at all. As far as the official record shows, the murder of Maria Ridolph is still open, still unsolved, a file with no name attached to it, sitting exactly where it was before any of this started. Before the deathbed confession, before the trial, before the exoneration. Sycamore got its answer once. For 4 years, the town believed it had one. Then that answer was taken back, formally, permanently, by the very system that gave it in the first place. What's left is the same question this town has carried since a single December night in 1957, when the first snow fell, and a little girl went outside to play. If it wasn't him, who was it? And after almost 70 years, in a town that once trusted its unlocked doors, are they still out there? If you'd been in Sycamore that night, would you have let your daughter play outside alone in the dark? Let us know in the comments. What's your honest take on McCullough? Do you believe he was truly innocent, or just that the evidence wasn't strong enough? Drop your opinion below. If the real killer is still out there, do you think this case will ever actually be solved? Share your theory in the comments. If this case disturbed you as much as it disturbed us, hit like so. YouTube shows it to more people who need to hear this story. And make sure you're subscribed. Every week we dig deep into cold cases like this one, the ones that were never truly solved, or worse, solved wrong. The next case we cover might shake you even more than this one did.